my talk isn't based on any one organization that I've worked for. It's really a culmination of the last 30 years of being at work. And it's really to just highlight some of the reasons that I think that what we've been taught all our lives, from the moment we start school to the moment we start in the workplace, is fundamentally wrong in today's complex world. So where I'm going to start with this guy here, Frederick Winslow Taylor. So he was an American mechanical engineer. He was born around 1850. So he'd have been about 170 years old now. But he had a theory that there was a single best way to perform each job. And in the Paris Expo in 1900, he actually had a tent set up to demonstrate to anybody that wanted to come and see how his manufacturing techniques could actually turn 50 feet of steel into metal chips every minute, when the normal was roughly 9 feet. And as you can imagine, this drew a lot of attention. People loved what he was doing. They couldn't believe how he was doing it, basically getting a 500% increase on what they were doing in their own factories. And it wasn't because he was using any different equipment. It was the areas that he was looking at. So he was concentrating on the optimal temperature to cut steel chips, the optimal distance between the machinist and the lathe, the optimal speed for the conveyor belt. What he'd done, he'd measured absolutely everything and decided that actually this is how that work should be done. There is only one way to do it in the most efficient manner. And at the time of the Industrial Revolution, this was a huge breakthrough, and it transformed the world of work. Now, Taylor's what they call scientific management principles, they've dominated what we've been taught all the way through the 20th century and even until today. And actually, a lot of these principles are still valid, or at least partly valid, if you're working in a structured, repeatable environment. So if you're working on a car production line, for example, where you know up front what the ultimate output is supposed to be, this works fantastically. Well, even though that work has many moving parts, the outcome can be determined from the start. So it's a complicated piece of work, but ultimately it can be determined from the start. Where these scientific principles break down is the type of work that we're all being exposed to nowadays, which is what we call knowledge work. So it takes a lot more brain power as opposed to just manual labor. So where the outcome is not always known up front, where you've got things that change along the processor, somewhere in the value stream. It may be customer feedback, it may be environmental conditions that change, things that need fast reactive input, where you need to be more adaptive, where there is no longer a single correct way of doing something. So we're working in more of a complex world nowadays, which is non-deterministic. So just some interesting numbers here, in that if we look at the Fortune 500 from 1955, only 52 of those companies are still on that list. That's just over 10%. The other 89%, they've either gone bankrupt, they've merged or been bought out, or they still exist, but they're just not on the list. They've dropped off the bottom of it. And this isn't because they were not large, they weren't powerful or resilient companies, because they all were. But the common theme that they all have is that they weren't adaptive. They couldn't adapt to the way that the world was changing and becoming more complex. The average lifespan of a company. So McKinsey did a study a few years ago, and it basically stated that in 1958, the average lifespan of a company was 61 years. Today, that is 18 years. And what they're also predicting is that by 2027, 70%, 75% actually of those companies that are on the Fortune 500 today, they won't exist. 75% will be gone in the next 7 years. If we also look at how long it takes companies or new organizations to reach a market cap of $1 billion, so to be classed as a unicorn, the typical Fortune 500 company takes 20 years to do that, to get that market cap of $1 billion. Uber got to a market cap of 10 billion within 3 years. Snapchat, 2.5 years. And a company called Juul Labs, who actually make e-cigarettes, they did it in 7 months. Now, the cost of entry into these markets is so much lower than it ever has been at any time in history. It enables new startups, new companies, new initiatives to come in and make a dent in the market and actually take people's customers away if those existing organizations don't innovate. And you can look at the example of Blockbuster. So in 2000, Netflix went to them and they offered to sell themselves to Blockbuster for 50 million, and they got laughed out of the door because Blockbuster could not see that actually online videos was part of the future. So let's actually explore what is complicated versus complex. So complicated problems or systems, they could be quite large, normally are quite large, but to actually spend some time, could be quite a lot of computing power to look at them, you can understand ultimately what the final solution could be. So there may be a lot of moving parts, but it's quite deterministic. Now they're the kind of problems that we've been facing throughout most of the 20th century. But more recently, those problems have become more complex in that the moving parts are something that cannot always be foreseen or controlled. And if any one of these moving parts changes, it may or may not have an effect on the solution that we're trying to build or the system that we're in. So these could be customers changing their minds, could be political impact, economic impact, social, technological, legislative, all of those things can impact a complex system. One thing that we can say is that the complicated solutions of yesterday, they don't work on the complex problems that we have today. We need more adaptive solutions. So some of you may have heard the term VUCA. It's a term that I think it came into existence around about 1990, but it's been heavily used by the military. And you may have heard the term that we now live in a VUCA world, implying that it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So again, what worked yesterday may not work today. We need to validate our assumptions. Most of the issues and problems that we see nowadays that we're trying to solve, they have a lot of non-linear moving parts, and we don't know everything up front. So those traditional ways of Winslow Taylor, going back 150 years, they don't work in a VUCA world. So does that mean that we should throw away everything that we've learned? Absolutely not, it doesn't. And this is the conundrum. Most organizations, they have two main needs. That is of exploit and to explore. So they need to look backwards and they need to look at what already works within their organizations, and they need to exploit that in order to continue with their revenue streams as best they can. And these are processes that are generally quite well known. And those traditional ways of working are often quite suited to these exploit activities. Whereas with explore, you're looking forward, looking for possible opportunities that don't yet exist. The kind of ideas that you want to grab and try, and iterate upon, get feedback on, and learn. The kind of opportunities that are going to grow your organization in the future. And if you don't, somebody else will do. So some examples of exploit: to optimize proven products and services, where the processes are understood, predictable, and the plans are detailed. You focus on reducing the costs and increasing efficiency, outperforming the forecast that you have in place or achieving planned milestones. Whereas the examples of explore, it could be creating new products or services, products that are unpredictable or experimental. You've got to focus on that learning, achieving product and market fit, actually understanding what works and what doesn't. And just to go into, the types of issues and problems that we do have nowadays. So simple and complicated. These are the areas that we know well. They are deterministic. We can look forward with a sense of certainty that if we put enough work in at the start, we know the outcomes that we're going to come, that are going to come at the end. And these are well suited to those exploit types of working. Whereas as we move further towards explore, that's the sweet spot for adaptive ways of working with short feedback loops. This is the complex area that most of us probably work in for most of our time today. The last thing I would add is if you find some of your work is actually up towards the top right of this figure here, in the anarchy domain, then you really want to try and push that down towards complex, complicated, or simple in any way that you can. And Dave Snowden has done some great work on that if you wanted to look him up. So really, just to sum up, the traditional scientific management ways of working, which have been taught all throughout our school days and probably through most of our business days up until recently, they have their place, but in a lot of the problems that we need to solve in the 21st century, they're no longer adequate. We need to look at more adaptive, responsive, and agile ways of working. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Pete. I think we did have a couple of questions. Yeah, well done. Nice one.
Thank you, Pete.
There is a question from John. John, do you want to ask the question?
I can try. So I think my question was around about the systems thinking mindset, and whether that's an imperative for working on these new complex systems.
I think it is, but bear in mind that whenever you use system thinking to map out an organization or an issue or whatever you're mapping out, what's the best way to put this? All tools are wrong, but some can be useful. So it's a good starting point, but I think invariably it never gives you the whole answer. It may point you in a direction that you can go and tweak and change, and inspect and adapt, for want of a better word. But there are no silver bullets.
Okay, so more usable around the explore as opposed to the exploit.
I think so, yeah. What else have we got here?
Barry's got a question.
Yes, carry on. So Cynefin. Yeah, so I think Cynefin, again, Dave Snowden, that fits in well with the graphic I had on that last page, with simple, complicated, complex, and anarchy. Dave Snowden's Cynefin image, which is the 4 quadrants and the little black box in the middle, I think it aligns very well. It's a slightly different perspective on it. But yeah, I think the Cynefin framework is quite useful as well, yeah.
Sorry, just one more question from myself, if I can. So are you suggesting that possibly organisations need to have cookbooks of technology, so allowed or shared technologies around teams, or are you're saying that we need to conform more towards the technologies that we use, because obviously we don't want to move into the anarchy corner?
No, and I think that's interesting, because that anarchy corner it's a culmination of not knowing what we want and not knowing how we're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can simplify either of those, then that's going to take you out that top right-hand quadrant.
Yeah.
Probably down into complex. It's only when you really start to understand both of those variables that you get back down into complicated or simple.